Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host for this week, Jack Malde, Senior Policy Analyst at the Bipartisan Policy Center. I'm excited to welcome 4 distinguished immigration scholars from Cornell Law School to take us through their new white paper, Immigration Reform, A Path Forward. We have Steve Yale-Loehr, Randel Keith Johnson, Charles Kamasaki, and BPC's own Theresa Cardinal Brown, who will be talking to us today with her Cornell Law School hat on. We're going to hear about important reforms that can be implemented in border management and asylum policy, worker programs, and dreamer protections. Even though comprehensive immigration reform looks unlikely to move forward in Congress soon, according to these scholars, targeted reforms in these areas are both urgently needed and potentially achievable. All of that in just a bit, so stay tuned. I am pleased to welcome to This Week in Immigration 4 authors of a paper from Cornell Law School's Immigration, Law and Policy Research Program. First, Steve Yale-Loehr is a professor of immigration law practice at Cornell Law School and of counsel at the law firm of Miller in Ithaca, New York. Steve has written, taught, and practiced immigration law for more than 35 years, and he is the director of the Immigration Law and Policy Research Program at Cornell. He's a return guest to the podcast. Steve joined us back in July on episode 148 to talk about the Supreme Court's decision on Biden's deportation priorities. So welcome back, Steve.
Glad to be here again.
Next, we have Randy Johnson. Randy is a distinguished immigration scholar at Cornell Law and has worked in immigration and labor policy for more than 30 years, working on Capitol Hill, at executive agencies, and the private sector. As Senior Vice President for Labor, Immigration, and Employee Benefits Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Randy was part of negotiations for comprehensive immigration reform in Congress from the late 1990s to the last attempt in 2013. So welcome to This Week in Immigration, Randy.
Yeah, thank you for this opportunity to talk about our paper.
Great. And Charles Kamasaki is the 3rd member of the Cornell Immigration Scholars Group and has also previously guested on This Week in Immigration. Charles is a senior advisor to the president at Unidos US, the largest Latino civil rights organization in the country, where he works on issues relating to immigration policy, immigrant rights, and immigrant integration. Having been part of immigration legislative campaigns, including negotiations on the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, Charles has decades of experience in this area. His book about IRCA and how it came to be, Immigration Reform, The Corpse That Will Not Die, was featured when he was last on this podcast on episode 83 back in 2020. So welcome back, Charles.
Great to be back, Jack. Thank you.
And last but not least is BPC's own Theresa Cardinal Brown, who in April of 2023 joined this group of distinguished immigration scholars at Cornell Law School. And today she's here to talk about her work on this paper with her fellow scholars. So Theresa, welcome back.
Welcome to you, Jack.
Great to have you guys. So, Steve, you're the director of the program. I want to start with you. Before we dive into the reforms outlined in the paper, can you tell us a bit about the Immigration Law and Policy program at Cornell and how you managed to pull together this group of immigration scholars?
Well, I received some foundation funding to set up this research program at the law school, and then I sought out sort of people that like Charles and Randy and Theresa, that are very expert and knowledgeable about immigration law and policy. Among the 4 of us, we have over 150 years of experience in dealing with, Charles, you're shaking your head there.
You make us sound old, Steve.
We've got a lot of experience dealing with immigration policy issues in Washington, D.C., and we also represent a broad spectrum on the political climate regarding immigration issues. So we decided that we thought we might try to do something on immigration reform, that together we might be able to achieve something that individually we've not been able to achieve before. So we had a conference in February of 2024 at the National Press Club. And we brought together over 200 people from across the political spectrum talking about immigration reform. And the first topic is whether comprehensive immigration reform, whether one bill to reform our entire broken immigration system would be possible. And we decided that given the politics of the situation, that would be impossible. but that narrower targeted reforms still are politically achievable and are urgently needed. And so that's how we came out of the conference. And after that, we brainstormed among the four of us and with a small focus group of other experts around the country, decide what are those areas that we wanted to focus on. And we decided on three areas. One is border management and asylum reform. Second are worker programs. And third are what to do about the so-called dreamers, this people who came here at an early age. Now, that's not the whole world of immigration reform that's needed. There are a lot of other areas that are important, like the Farm Workforce Modernization Act or measures to attract and retain more STEM workers. But we decided that's where our value add is. We know these areas really well, and we thought that if we could achieve political compromise on these three areas among us, we might have a chance at influencing policy in Washington, D.C.
Great. And can you tell us a little bit more about how did you choose these three areas? You say you have expertise in these areas. Do you see them as areas that have potential for reform at the moment?
We do. I mean, as others will talk about, for example, on the DREAM Act, people have been talking about helping those dreamers for more than 15 years now, but have come close, but not quite gotten through Congress. On worker visas, everybody realizes we have a labor shortage, but we have not been unable to reform the work visa programs. And currently, the border issues on the U.S.-Mexico border are particularly intractable. But we think that we each have expertise that we could bring to the table to try to work out compromises on each of these that we think Democrats and Republicans and the American public could live with.
Great. And did you see now as a particularly ripe and important time for change? And is that why you released the paper now?
Yes and no. I mean, I think when we started this idea of having a conference back last January, immigration was important. Everybody realized we had a broken immigration system, but we didn't realize with our timing that how important it was going to be coming. Right now, funding for Ukraine and Israel is being held up because of negotiations over possible reforms to our border issues. So we think our white paper fortuitously came out at a very important time.
Great. Well, thanks, Steve, for that background and context. Let's dive into the substance of the paper. So the first section in the paper discusses border management and asylum reform. That was led by Theresa. So, Theresa, can you tell us a bit more about the issue that you're tackling here?
Sure. So as Steve mentioned, and as we've talked a lot about on this podcast, the situation at the U.S.-Mexico border with the arrival of millions of people, many of whom are seeking asylum, has created lots of strains on our asylum system, our immigration system, our border system, our ports of entry, and it's also obviously a large political issue right now. When we were putting together this section of the paper, we were trying to think about what are changes that are needed to bring order back to the border. And it's not just about, stopping people from coming in, but really thinking about the evolution of our asylum system, our process for when we encounter people at the border, how they process the infrastructure we have. We also thought a little bit, and this is probably one of the newer things in the paper, about how our immigration system is just diffused across a lot of our government, and that makes it difficult to sort of coordinate across the government. So one of our recommendations is about how we do a better job as a federal government in managing immigration across all of these different departments and agencies. So we looked at this from a couple of different aspects. We recognize, obviously, there is a security component to this. Border security has been important to the United States for a very long time, took greater significance after 9/11, but there are issues of criminality, drug smuggling. We talk a lot about the fentanyl issues coming across the border that have to be recognized. Yes, there is a migration crisis at the border, but there's also these other things that have to be addressed. And so we do take a law enforcement look at it. We also look at what is motivating this migration right now, and are there things that the US government can do along with other countries to try to address these factors that are motivating people to come. But we do have to look at our asylum system at the border, which was designed at a time when the number of people who were actually seeking asylum at the border was very, very small compared to most of the migrants who are trying to come across illegally, maybe seeking work. The number of people asking for asylum was small enough that most of them did come to ports of entry. And that's no longer the case. We also had a system that was designed when most of the encounters were Mexican people. Most of them were adults and single adults and not families with small children coming from last year more than 100 countries around the world. So there's been very big changes. And also the growing backlogs in our system. Because of these arrivals, our immigration courts are backlogged, our asylum offices, at USCIS are backlogged. And so our ability to sort of just adjudicate our way out of this is very limited. So these are the things that we were looking at when we tried to consider the border section of this paper. And we make recommendations on how to deal with all of these different factors.
Yeah, clearly very complex issues, quite a few different issues you're tackling. Can you tell us a bit more about the solutions that you propose in the paper?
Sure. So on the border processes itself, and again, some of this is border related and some of this is before the border or after the border. But the first priority we say is we need to make it a priority to go after smugglers and criminal organizations that are not only facilitating this migration wave, but are encouraging it and making money off of it. And in doing so, exploiting and taking advantage of the migrants who are in desperate circumstances. And so we need to view this as a criminal issue, a law enforcement issue. We need to gain support from partners across the hemisphere to really tackle this as a criminal and law enforcement issue. Because without doing that, at the moment, these smugglers are part of these transnational criminal organizations. They have been incorporated into the drug cartels as another line of business. And they have become increasingly sophisticated in how they move migrants to and through the border. And that's creating significant challenges in addressing it because whenever we try to do something new, they continue to adapt. And so this requires effort to look into it. The next thing we said is what can we do so that migrants don't feel that smugglers are the only way they can make it to the border? And that entails looking at other legal ways that migrants might be able to come to the United States to seek asylum, for refugee status, for work. What can we do to expand legal pathways? And Randy's section talks a lot about work visas, but we need to create alternatives so that people don't feel like their only choice is to engage a smuggler and come to the border. We also want to look at the asylum system at the border. So right now, the law says that once you step foot on U.S. soil, you're entitled to ask for asylum, no matter how you arrive. And that was put in law primarily because there were circumstances in which someone who's really escaping governmental persecution may not have a choice but to come in an irregular way. And we want to make sure that we're not turning away people who would suffer persecution. But the challenge has become that which was relatively sort of an exception to the regular rules of if you come illegally, you're deportable, has become the norm. And so that's no longer sustainable. So we do need to find a way to adapt our border asylum policies to try to, again, move people in a direction of applying through a port of entry where it's more regularized, rather than going in between a port of entry and having our border patrol, which is not designed to really deal with migration crises like this, not having to deal with it. So we talk about creating differentiations between people who come through a port of entry and who don't. We want to expedite to the extent we can, in a fair way, the asylum adjudication process so that we are more quickly understanding who really has a case for asylum and who may not and really should be finding another way to come. And then lastly, sort of our overarching recommendation is getting at what I said earlier about the diffuse nature of the immigration authorities in our government. There are 5 different cabinet departments, over 20 different agencies or sub-agencies that are involved in every aspect of our immigration system, from visas overseas to labor certifications to, the border to, every part of this. And it's even in the White House, which is the one place you would think it would all be coordinated. There's parts of this that are overseen by the National Security Council or the Domestic Policy Council. So we suggest we really do need to create a new office in the White House, in the executive office of the president, called the Office of Migration Policy, that would be responsible for really looking at the entire system as a system. Because what we can't have happen, that has been happening in the past, is where agencies are kind of looking out for their own authorities and their own portions of this, and creating more problems for other parts of the system. So that's one of our key recommendations, is really to not just get a handle on the border, but to look at all of our immigration system in a more better way. We need to consider this.
Yeah, those solutions sound really reasonable to me. Obviously, border and asylum policy is a hugely contentious area. It can be emotionally charged. Republicans and Democrats, well, the perception is that they disagree quite a lot on this issue. So how realistic do you think these solutions are, and what are the chances that they can actually unite both sides?
So, I will say that we had 2 considerations in drafting the paper. One was, what are the policies we think are necessary and workable, right? What will actually help solve the problem we're trying to address? And the second was, do we think that they are politically viable? Could they bring Republicans and Democrats together? I think they can bring reasonable Republicans and Democrats together. And I put the context reasonable there because as you mentioned, there's a lot of political issues at play here. Certainly for Republicans, they have made no secret of the hope that they can use the failure to manage and control the border against President Biden in a presidential reelection campaign, in congressional reelection campaigns. Like, that is one of their political issues to try to get elected. I think Democrats also see immigration as an issue that motivates their base, and that open, more pro-immigration and immigrant policies help them. And so there is sort of a dynamic there at play. That having been said, even over the last 10 years, and certainly right now, there are folks in both parties that are seriously engaged in trying to come to some sort of agreement. We think that these ideas can help them in that prospect. One of the challenges is that for a lot of members of Congress, they don't really understand all of the dynamics at play in these things. Immigration law is very complicated. And so really helping them understand what can work and what might not work and what would create more difficulties rather than less is part of what we hope this paper can achieve. And also, we're trying to address issues of concern to both parties. We want to preserve asylum for those who really need it. But we also need to address the security issues of the border. The drug crisis is significant and serious. And even though it's not directly related to the immigrants coming across the border seeking asylum, it is, in a resource way, pulling law enforcement authorities to addressing that rather than necessarily addressing fentanyl. So we have to look at those issues as well.
And Theresa, you mentioned that there are some members of Congress working on these issues. Congress is currently trying to negotiate some border solutions. I'm interested to know how your solutions compare to what is being proposed in Congress and by the White House.
Well, some pieces are there. We know that in the conversations that are happening in the Senate right now, for example, on the Ukraine and Israel funding bill that Steve mentioned, one of the things they're looking at is the standard for seeking asylum, and we do talk in our paper about maybe differentiating who's eligible for to seek asylum, or the ways they can seek asylum based on whether they're entering at a port of entry or before a port of entry. So, how that falls out and how that relates directly, we have to kind of wait and see where they're at. Another area that they are looking at is some of these international things. My understanding is that they are looking at, what can we get other countries to do in terms of protecting and managing migrants who are coming through their territories. Things that they're talking about that is not necessarily in our paper are the parole programs that the Biden administration has put in place. Now, we talk about alternative regular pathways. We mainly are talking about refugee processing or work visas, but these parole programs are alternative legal ways people can come to the United States. Republicans would like to see them restricted. Democrats in the administration, for the most part, oppose that. The parole programs have limitations. They don't lead directly to long-term status in the United States. They can be overturned by another administration. And, the expansive use of them has created political pushback. So we would much rather see an expansion of legal programs in the immigration law by Congress necessarily than an over-reliance on parole. But limiting parole in legislation may have other unintended consequences in the future when we see different kinds of world crisis that may require a more nimble response, such as the evacuation from Afghanistan or Ukraine, which were two large uses of parole in the recent years.
Great. Well, thank you, Theresa. We're going to take a short break, but when we come back, we'll be talking with Randy and Charles about worker visas and solutions for dreamers. So don't go anywhere. Okay, moving on to the next section of the paper, we have two proposals to create new worker visa programs. Randy, you led this section and have been part of a lot of legislative actions on these types of proposals. Tell us what you recommended here and why or how they differ from past worker programs that Congress has considered.
Well, thanks, Jack. And I think my area, although very controversial in the past, is less of a Rubik's Cube than all the issues Theresa just went through. And I think the reason I'm saying that is because I believe there is a general consensus now in America that we are facing a worker shortage. Now, the solutions to that can be debated, and we'll talk about that. But I think there is a consensus on that fact. And even to the extent people might argue the economics, no one really debates what I call the demographic arguments anymore. And I just want to read some factoids, and I want to read them because I want to make sure I got them accurately, because it is a compelling case. But as baby boomers age, 10,000 people turn 65 every day, with someone turning 65 every 8 seconds. Now, I'm already past that, so I'm not turning 65, so I'm not part of that. But the Census Bureau projects that starting next year, this number will increase to 12,000 people turning 65 every day. By 2030, all baby boomers will turn 65 or older. This means 1 in every Americans will be at traditional retirement age. So, it used to be in America, we had like a triangle. And of course, that's what Social Security was based on, which is elderly people retired. And then we had a base of workers who fed the system. And as long as we had a base moving money up to the top to people who are retired that work. But America is really turning into like a square where we have a lot of people retiring at the top and the worker base is shrinking. Now, that's just not unusual in the United States. Japan is probably the preeminent example of that, but it's common to Western European democracies generally. And no one can really argue those demographics. So what are we going to do about that? Well, immigration is part of the solution. That doesn't mean uncontrolled immigration. It does not mean open borders, which is a straw man many people use. No one's talking about open borders, but it does mean increased controlled legal immigration to allow immigrants to come into the country and fill worker programs where U.S. workers are not available. Now, this is not a new argument. As you mentioned, I've been doing this since probably 2001, and fortunately still have a job and still working on the issue. But in S744, we had a huge, massive worker program, or significant worker program that we negotiated with the AFL-CIO. Did not get out of the House for various reasons. So where are we now? So there's basically 3 proposals, but 2 major ones in what we submitted in the white paper. Of course, I'm going to talk about the healthcare one first. So because this area, even though there's a general consensus that we have facing a worker shortage, it's still very controversial, and the unions still have many concerns about the scope of programs. So one of the proposals we picked in our paper was, look, let's take something narrow and use it as a test case, and we picked healthcare services. What do I mean about healthcare services? Well, I don't mean big pharma, and I don't mean the insurance industry. These are areas like hospitals and elder care, nursing homes, where there's a hands-on need for workers to help take care of the elderly population, which I just mentioned is going to grow, correct? And we thought that surely in the healthcare services area, the vast majority of Americans, all of whom are going to become old at some point, who probably have relatives in nursing homes or at home who need in-home services, can recognize, yeah, this is an area we have a shortage of workers, one, and two, it's vitally important to, frankly, ourselves as individuals and our parents and relatives. So, yeah, this is an area where Congress ought to act. So, politically, something we thought every congressman and senator ought to be able to explain on the floor, right, on the Senate floor to constituencies, build a base, and therefore move forward with it and get that enacted, and that might leave room for more expansive programs later on, which I'll talk about. And furthermore, Jack, we proposed a sunset date to this idea, as others in the paper, in the idea that, okay, maybe we don't have everything right, but here's a problem, here's a solution, and in 15 years, we'll re-examine it. So therefore, if we got something wrong, okay, we can re-examine it and take care of it. But Congress, let's move forward on an area where clearly there is a need, and most Americans can understand that need. So the proposal is a healthcare visa specifically for the healthcare services industry. And it's unique in the sense of, believe it or not, there really is not another visa on the books that's industry specific, although one might argue that H-2A agricultural is similar to this, which we note in our white paper. So that was number one. And my view of it is the House of Representatives should do it on the suspension calendar, and then the Senate takes it up and get it on President Biden's desk. But maybe that will be like next month. And I'll come back to that. The other one is a more generic, broader proposal based on the Smucker bill, which is frankly supported by industry. But it forms the basis of a broader worker program that could be negotiated with the unions that's more traditionally similar to what we negotiated in S744. I'm not going to go into all the technical issues like enforcement, how do you determine a prevailing wage. These are all areas that can be negotiated and have been negotiated in the past. But again, we would think perhaps the healthcare visa idea could be at the tip of the spear that might sort of create a precedent for a broader program after that. For the record, Jack, it's not saying other industries besides healthcare don't have worker shortages. Construction, restaurants, they all have that. But one of our problems in the immigration reform area is any train leaving the station, everybody wants to get on it. So the train gets so heavy, the train never leaves the station. So we've got to get beyond that. And then I think that's one of the theories of the white paper, which is let's do a little bit first, and then maybe we can pull other parts of the train later on. And I can talk about a little more about the technical details, if you wish, on how those worker programs work. The other part I did want to mention, Jack, was we also have a discussion in here on trying to give states greater flexibility in the area of, well, the theory is Congress isn't acting. Let's give the states some flexibility to address their own worker shortage issues, perhaps state by state or even on a regional basis. This is not a new idea, but it's come from a frustration that Congress isn't acting. Clearly, states have worker shortages, and let's give the states some flexibility to enact their own legislation. Now, because of preemption issues, that would take changes by Capitol Hill to authorize state governors or counties to do that. It sounds like a very reasonable idea. There are a lot of details that would have to be worked out on that because clearly Congress would have to add certain guardrails to that kind of proposal. While we developed this proposal, Jack, and I'll close out by saying this, other, of course, areas of state flexibility have come up. One is giving states, like in New York, just a narrow power to expand work authorizations for migrants now coming into the country or have been, frankly, bussed up from Texas to New York, et cetera, and need jobs, and they need to get work authorization quickly and more quickly than the current system provides. The flip side of it, of course, is laws like in Texas and Florida, where many governors want greater flexibility to impose, one might argue, draconian immigration restrictions on migrants. So there's sort of three pots moving around in that state area. We don't get into all of them in our paper. We focus more on the worker shortage issue and state flexibility. But those are all areas floating out there right now with regard to this quasi need to give states greater flexibility. One person's flexibility is another person's draconian solution. It all depends where you sit. But certainly there's a great sort of sense of, if Congress isn't going to act, let the states take care of their own issues, and let's avoid litigation on the preemption issues and give them the flexibility in the statute to address what they see their own needs, whether it's Texas or it's New York, right? So that's kind of the three parts. There's something in there, I think, for I'm not going to say there's something in there for everybody, but certainly it's an area where there's a crying need to do something, and we've outlined various proposals to approach that.
Yeah, and a lot of those things you mentioned, we've discussed on the podcast before. We've talked about our aging population. We've talked about state-based visas as well. Randy, you mentioned a bill, the Smucker bill. Just for those listeners who don't know what that is, can you tell us, which bill is that, and remind us what that's all about?
Yeah, Congressman from Pennsylvania. He's a past construction employer. It's HR 3734. It's also co-sponsored by Representative Yale-Loehr from Texas. So we have one R and one D, so that makes it bipartisan. Again, it's similar to what we negotiated in S744, Jack, in terms of it covers all industries, but not high-tech type jobs. These are relatively lower skilled jobs. Well, we call them essential worker jobs, but not those that fall into the H-1B category. And it would, again, form the basis of negotiations with the unions, similar to what we did in S744, and then move forward with that. You're probably going to ask me, well, what's the future of this? Everybody believes there's a worker shortage, so how come we're not doing it? Well, the air has all been taken up now by the debate over asylum and parole, which Theresa pointed out, which ironically, we never even really discussed asylum issues back in the S744 days, but now it's the issue, along with parole and, of course, border security writ large. But my hope, and I don't think this is too pie in the sky, would be that if we can get through this debate now going on and with Israeli funding, et cetera, and get some of these border issues settled, that would open the door to take up these other sort of long traditional standing areas, such as expanded worker programs. And of course, DACA issues, which Charles will get into, which may be taken up as part of the current discussions. The point is, if we can get border security done, get this asylum issue off the table, perhaps Congress could then move on to taking up some of these more traditional issues, which there seems to be a consensus on. Worker shortages is one of those. Now, other people would argue, Randy, once they take care of that, they're never going to revisit the issue. So, but we hear those arguments. You only get one shot. But we are where we are on this, and clearly asylum and border security is the preeminent issue. I think we have to get those off the table before we can move on to some of these other issues, which have a long history and I think a consensus on. But that would be certainly my hope.
Yep, it does seem there's a consensus on this issue. It'd be great if we could work on it now, but as you say, I guess there are other things that are dominating the conversation. So maybe we have to be a bit patient on this. And yeah, the Smucker-Sweller Act, I think it goes by the name of the Essential Workers for Economic Advancement Act. Well, thanks so much, Randy. I think we're going to move on to our final guest. The final section of the paper concerns dreamer protections. So, Charles, can you start by letting the audience know who are dreamers and what situation do they find themselves in?
Well, I think most listeners to this podcast, Jack, are familiar with dreamers, but for those who aren't, these are people brought to this country as minors without authorization. So I think the key aspect there is there was no moral or legal agency that as minors, they did not make a decision to commit an offense or to violate U.S. immigration laws. There is a second group, a much smaller one, called documented dreamers. And these are people who were brought to this country with their families, typically under worker visas that had time limitations where their parents overstayed their visa. So they grew up in this country for some period of time and then found themselves in undocumented status. As to your second question around where do they find themselves? Well, the vast majority of them are undocumented. And so they live largely outside the scope of protection of the law. Some number of them, of Dreamers, have deferred action for childhood arrivals or DACA status, but even they have what many people have called a liminal existence in this country, that their legal status is renewable every couple of years, but there is no guarantee that they'll be able to stay beyond that.
And how many Dreamers do we estimate there are, whether documented or undocumented?
In, I believe, 2021, the Migration Policy Institute, which both Steve and I are associated with, made an estimate that about 2.3 million people were eligible for the DREAM Act. Now, without going into a lot of complications, there are some limitations about who might be eligible, who might be demographically eligible, but may not be legally eligible for some of these programs. But I think 2.3 million in 2021 is a pretty good number. And there are probably about 80,000 a year who are added as they age into the program, as it were. So we'd be talking about potentially in the 2.5 million range.
And you briefly mentioned the DACA program. Can you, just for any listeners who aren't aware, explain that in a little bit more detail, and why is that not sufficient for Dreamers?
Yes, this is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. This was enacted or established by President Obama in 2012. It made people who were eligible, it made people who came to this country prior to 2012 eligible for 2-year renewable protections from deportation and work authorization. That program is currently under legal challenge. So there are 2, or really 3, major limitations. One, that program, because of its potential legal challenges, could go out of existence at any time. Second, even if it continues, this is a 2-year renewable status, as I indicated earlier, and there is no future guarantees about people's ability to stay and work in this country. And finally, because of original requirements for the DACA program, it only covered a small portion of the total Dreamer population. And so there were significant numbers of those who were left out. So even if the DACA program itself were to be somehow continued, it would only cover a fraction of the Dreamer population.
Great. That's really useful context. Let's move on to the proposal you make in the paper. Can you tell us all about that?
Yes, it's roughly based on a bill called the Succeed Act, which was introduced in 2017 by 2 Republican senators, Lankford and Tillis. And just to set the context, if people will remember, President Trump in 2017 ended the DACA program, or tried to end the DACA program, until it was successfully maintained via litigation. So Senators Lankford and Tillis introduced the bill as, in their own words, to try and protect that population in the event the DACA program went away. Our proposal is a slight modification of that, and just to be clear about what it does, it makes most Dreamers, so that 2.3, 2.5 million people, eligible for a conditional residence status. It does not provide a special path to citizenship, which has been a matter of some controversy. And while they are in that status, Dreamers would not be eligible to petition for relatives from abroad, nor would they have access to many public benefits. So that's the proposal in short.
You mentioned the 2017 Succeed Act. Can you tell us what actually happened with that bill?
Well, that bill was never acted on because, as I noted earlier, the DACA program was continued. even over the objections of the Trump administration. And it was meant as a solution to the end of the DACA program. But there are some differences between our proposal and the Succeed Act, and I think they're important to note. Our proposal is both more restrictive and less restrictive. It's more restrictive in the sense that under the original Succeed Act, one could achieve a green card at the end of a 15-year period or so. What we are proposing is essentially an indefinite conditional status. And I would hope that future Congresses would act to allow those people to achieve green cards and eventual citizenship. So that's one important place where we are more restrictive than the original Succeed Act. Then the original Succeed Act also had, like DACA, a date of entry limitation, that you had to have been in the country in 2012 in order to be eligible to participate in that program. Our program is somewhat more expansive in that we don't put a limitation, and those who have become dreamers in essence after 2012 would be eligible. I guess the other important limitation is that as I read, and as at least some people read the original Succeed Act, those participants would be permanently barred from ever petitioning for their relatives. I personally don't think that's constitutional. Just full disclosure, I am not a constitutional scholar. But that, what we propose is that while folks are in this conditional status, they would not be able to petition for their relatives. So that's another place where we're slightly less restrictive.
And these differences between your proposal and the Succeed Act, do you think your proposal is essentially has more potential and has more potential in uniting both sides?
Well, uniting both sides is a challenge that I think a few of us are able to meet. But I do think it has a chance, and for this reason. One is that compromises often aren't simply a matter of taking one say, party's position and matching it up with another party's position and splitting it down the middle, although our proposal has some aspects of that. I think very often it's one side gets something it wants very badly, and the other side gets something else it wants very badly. So in the current conversations around the border, for example, there are Democrats, Senator Murphy from Connecticut has been one of them, who has basically said, if you Republicans are expecting us to accept severe changes to the asylum system, we're going to want something like enactment of the DREAM Act. And Senators Langford and Tillis, coincidentally or not coincidentally, have responded that they would not allow a path to citizenship for Dreamers. So our conditional status without a special path to citizenship might well be one of those things that ends up on the table.
Great. Well, thank you, Charles. That covers the sections of the paper. I want to move back to Steve just for some final reflections. Steve, what has the reception been to the paper, and what do you hope happens? And also for folks that want to read the paper themselves, where can they find it?
Well, we haven't had our bill enacted into law yet, but otherwise I think we have felt that it has been received positively. We've gotten many calls and emails from staffers and have talked with members of Congress about our proposals. And we think that particularly right now, given all the discussions about changing our management of the border at the U.S.-Mexico border, there is an opportunity not just for the border parts of our paper, but for the other parts of our paper to be seriously considered by Congress. Theresa wrote a great op-ed in The Hill last week about the border aspects of our proposal. And so we're getting a lot of attention, and I count that as a success by itself. In terms of how people can find our paper, it's pretty easy. Just Google Cornell Immigration White Paper, and you'll get right to it. So we hope that this podcast will spread the word even farther, and that over the next couple of weeks in particular, people will take up our proposal seriously.
Great. And we'll include some relevant links in the podcast description for people as well. So before we end this episode, I just want to give you guys the opportunity to add anything that you think is important to mention. Anything else that you guys want to raise here?
Yeah, Jack, one thing, and Theresa touched on it, but let me elaborate. The worker proposals are not just economically based; they're also based on the concept that Theresa hinted at, that they also would promote national and border security by filling jobs legally and therefore eliminating the job magnet that attracts and promotes illegal immigration. That's summarizing it in one or two sentences. A little more complicated, but it's certainly true. And it is unfortunate that the worker proposals are not sort of part right now of the broader border debate, but it's certainly an underpinning as to why those kinds of programs are really so important to be enacted.
Absolutely. Makes sense to me.
I just want to take a moment to say thank you to my fellow scholars and to Steve for pulling us together. And for coming on our BPC podcast to talk about it, flipping my hat back over. The Bipartisan Policy Center exists to try to find bipartisan solutions to hard problems. And I think what Charles said about that's not necessarily always just splitting the difference between both sides. It's finding what's workable and has political viability. And that really was the guiding star for this paper. And so I do think, even though I wrote it with the Cornell hat on, it's in line with the ethos that we've tried at the BPC to put forward on immigration for 10 years now, which is how do we find the right policies that bring the parties together? And even though we haven't succeeded yet, that's still the North Star and guidance. So I just want to thank Randy and Steve and Charles and our other scholars for this great collaboration that I very much appreciated being part of.
And similarly, if I could end up with my piece with a commercial for the Cornell Scholars Program. In these debates, as in many others that take place these days, most of the time we're just talking to people who already agree with us. We're all in our own bubbles. And what's been enormously innovative and different about the program that Steve has pulled together is that many of us come from different political perspectives and different political traditions, one. Secondly, it's a rare program in that it marries traditional scholarship with people who have not just been scholars, but who have been practitioners. And so Randy and his former identities and myself and Theresa, who's also worked in the government, and other scholars who work both on the Hill and in government, we bring, I think, a unique ability to marry research and practice. And I think that's a unique contribution to the debate at a time when so much policy discourse is so polarized.
Thank you, Charles. That's a great note to end on. I just want to thank all of you guys for joining us. Steve, Charles, Randy, and Theresa, thank you so much. And I hope to have you back.
Thank you, Jack. Thanks. Theresa.
Thank you.
And that's a wrap on this episode of This Week in Immigration. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on the X platform at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow Theresa Cardinal Brown at BPC_T Brown, and you can follow me at Jack Malde. Send your comments and feedback to us by email to immigration@bipartisanpolicy.org. I'm Jack Malde. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This episode was written by myself and Theresa Cardinal Brown. Joshua Joe is our audio editor. The executive producer of BPC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. Talk to you next time on This Week in Immigration.